The moment Jensen Clark held up that deed and sneered at Mark Bates, every ranch hand in the barn felt something shift in the air. It was the kind of moment that splits a man's life clean in two. Before and after. And nobody, not even Jensen, with all his money and all his pride, had any idea what that after was about to unleash. Mark stood there, in the stale heat of the Double C barn, his hat trembling in his tired hands. 40 years of his sweat, 40 years of sunburns, broken bones, early mornings, and late nights, all of it hung in the dust-filled air like a final breath. The barn usually smelled like sweet alfalfa, worn leather, and warm horses, but today the scent felt sharp and cold, like betrayal had its own smell and had settled right into the rafters. He had expected a handshake, maybe a cheap plaque. Maybe, if the rumors were true, the small pension Arthur Clark once promised him by the fence line. Instead, Jensen stood there in his lizard-skin boots and shiny gold watch, acting like this moment was nothing more than a meeting he wanted to end fast. "As you all know," Jensen said loudly, pacing in front of the ranch hands, "we're trimming the fat, clearing dead weight." Some of the cowboys looked away. Some clenched their jaws. All of them knew who he meant. Jensen flicked his manicured hand lazily toward Mark. "This one's been here too long. Insurance risk, slow, outdated. The ranch can't carry him anymore." Mark felt the words hit his chest like cold stones. He wasn't angry, not yet. Mostly he felt hollow, like someone had scooped out the heart he used to carry with so much pride. Then Jensen smiled. Not a kind smile. A smile that made every man in the barn stiffen. "But don't say I'm heartless," he added. "Grandfather scribbled something about taking care of him, so instead of money, we're giving him property." Mark's heart thumped. A cottage, maybe? A small field? Something he could live out his last years in peace? Jensen lifted a folded deed between two fingers. "Cinder Creek!" The barn fell silent. Cinder Creek wasn't just bad land. It was the worst land. Rattlesnakes. Broken rock. Flash, floods. A place where equipment rusted, horses panicked, and nothing grew except weeds meaner than barbed wire. Then came the final blow. "A rancher needs a horse," Jensen said, smirking. "And we just got a bulk lot from auction. Most are decent, but there's one we call trash." He snapped his fingers. Two stable boys let out a horse so broken it made even the toughest cowboys flinch. Filthy coat, cracked hooves, ribs showing like sharp bones under torn skin. The gelding jerked and reared in pure panic, whites of his eyes glowing like he was trapped in his own nightmare. "There you go," Jensen laughed. "Trash horse for the trash cowboy." A few ranch hands muttered curses under their breath. One walked out, unable to watch. Mark didn't move. Not until he stepped forward slowly toward the trembling animal. He made no sudden motion. No force. He just breathed out a soft humming sound he had used for decades on frightened colts. "Easy, son," he whispered. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you now." The horse froze, not in fear but confusion. Nobody had spoken to him like that in a long, long time. Mark took the lead rope, and without another word he walked past Jensen, past the snickering boys, past the barn where he had lived his whole working life. He didn't look back. The 5-mile walk to Cinder Creek felt like a slow trial across the desert. The sun burned his neck, dust stung his eyes, his joints groaned with every uneven step. The horse, who he'd quietly decided to call Cinder, shied at every shadow, pulled at the rope with each gust of wind. Mark kept going. Because, deep inside the ache of betrayal and the sting of humiliation, something new had begun to take shape. Something he had not felt in years. A spark. When they finally reached the shack, Mark stopped and stared at the leaning skeleton of rotten wood, the broken porch, the smashed windows. It looked like nature itself had given up on the place decades ago. "Well," he murmured to the trembling horse, "it ain't much, but it's ours." He didn't try to fix the house that night. He didn't even go inside. He chose the barn first. A cowboy always starts with the horse. Using nothing but his pocket knife, a rusty shovel, and the kind of stubborn resolve that only age can harden, Mark cleared out one stall. He gave Cinder the only apple he had. He watched the horse flinch, snap, then finally, hesitantly, begin to chew. Mark slept in the straw beside him, his back screaming, his stomach aching with hunger. But he slept with a purpose, because for the first time since Jensen handed him that humiliating deed, Mark felt alive. And as the night settled over Cinder Creek, that broken horse shifted closer to him, inch by inch, until Mark felt the warm brush of breath on his arm. In the dark silence of a forgotten patch of land, two creatures the world had thrown away began something that felt a lot like hope. The storm that struck 3 weeks later did not just shake the valley, it carved a new line in the story of a man and a horse who were never supposed to survive. And yet, that night, both of them began to rise. Since moving to Cinder Creek, Mark had fought every day just to keep himself and the horse alive. His joints locked every morning before sunrise, forcing him to stretch his back until he could stand straight. He patched the roof with scrap tin, boarded broken windows with old planks he dragged from the weeds, and scrubbed the floors of the shack with river sand until his hands bled. But none of that work compared to the patience needed to reach Cinder. Cinder wasn't just wild, he was wounded deep in his spirit. If Mark lifted a hand too quickly, the horse bolted. If Mark carried a rope, Cinder trembled. If Mark spoke too loudly, the gelding pressed himself into the farthest corner and shook like he was waiting for a beating. "Someone broke you," Mark whispered one morning as he watched the horse from the porch. "But we're gonna fix each other best we can." Progress came slow, like watching paint dry in winter. But it came. Cinder learned that Mark's hands never hit. Mark learned that Cinder's fear wasn't disobedience, it was memory. But the first real change came the night the sky turned the color of bruised grapes. The air thickened until Mark's ears popped. Wind roared between the canyon walls. The horses in the valley below began screaming. A supercell storm rolled in over the mountains like a wall of spinning darkness. Then thunder hit. Not a crack, not a rumble. A cannon blast. It shook the barn roof so hard dust fell in sheets. The horses Mark once tended on the Double C had always weathered storms in big, sturdy structures. But Cinder? He panicked inside their small barn with nowhere to run. Mark sprinted from the shack the moment he heard the first terrified scream. Rain hit him like gravel. Lightning lit up the sky in white flashes. He reached the paddock just in time to see Cinder plow into the fence, tearing skin as he tried to escape the storm itself. "Easy! Easy!" Mark shouted, though the wind ripped the words away. He got the gate open and drove the horse into the barn, slamming the door shut behind them. But inside was worse. Thunder on the tin roof sounded like explosions. The ground shook. Lightning flashed through every crack in the boards. Cinder reared, striking the walls with enough force to break a leg. Sweat poured down his sides. His eyes rolled white in panic. If he broke a bone out here, he wouldn't survive. And Mark knew it. Mark didn't chase him. He didn't yell. He walked into the center of the barn, sat down in the straw, and started to sing. His voice was rough and broken, but steady. A hymn his mother used to hum when his father worked. The mines and nights felt too long. In the garden. I come to the garden alone. He closed his eyes as he sang, letting the rhythm calm him first, because the horse needed him steady. Thunder battered the roof. Wind screamed. Lightning clawed across the sky. But Mark kept singing. For minutes, for hours, until the storm slowly rolled east and dawn crept through the barn's crooked boards. He drifted half asleep before a warm weight settled on his shoulder. Mark opened his eyes. Cinder stood over him, head low, muzzle, resting gentle as a prayer against Mark's coat. The wildness had softened. The fear had drained away. The horse let out a long, trembling sigh, the sound of an animal releasing years of held terror. Mark lifted a hand, slow as sunrise, and rested it against Cinder's warm jaw. "Morning, partner," he whispered. "Looks like we both made it." That day marked the beginning of everything that would follow. From then on, Cinder trusted him, not fully, not completely, but enough. And that was all Mark needed. Within weeks, Cinder's transformation became undeniable. Mark spent every dime he saved on hay and grain. He brushed away the filth layer by layer until a shimmering coat appeared underneath, a rare blue Roan, so bright it looked like polished steel in the sun. But the biggest discovery came when Mark checked his lip for a tattoo, a number, a letter, a breeder's mark under a scar. Mark's blood turned cold. "You're not trash," he whispered. "You're something somebody tried very hard to hide." He called in Martha, the sharp-tongued town clerk who had always held a quiet torch for him. She ran the numbers through old databases. 2 days later, she came flying down the dirt road, waving papers out her car window. "Mark, sit down!" He did. "That horse was insured for $200,000, she said breathlessly. "Registered name, Northern Dancer's Echo. Stolen 3 years ago from Kentucky. Vanished without a trace." Mark stared at Cinder grazing peacefully outside. A stolen treasure, thrown away like garbage. Someone had tried to erase him, just like Jensen had tried to erase Mark. Before Mark could speak, Martha handed him a second folder, survey maps. "And that isn't all," she said. "Your land sits on top of the main aquifer for the entire valley. The Double C's wells are failing, Mark. Without this water, they won't last another season." Mark looked at the small spring he had cleaned with his bare hands. Cinder Creek wasn't worthless. It was the key to everything. And then, like fate punching through the heat waves rising off the dirt road, a black truck appeared. It tore toward the gate in a cloud of dust. Jensen Clark stepped out. He looked at the watered pasture. He looked at the restored cabin. He looked at Cinder, shining, powerful, beautiful, and his jaw dropped. That's the trash horse," he whispered. "No," Mark said quietly, stepping between Jensen and the fence. "That's Cinder." Jensen's shock hardened into greed. "I'm taking him back. And the land. You can't keep any of it." "Try me," Mark said. There was no fear in his voice anymore. Because for the first time since losing everything, Mark Bates had something worth fighting for. The morning of the Founders' Race came with a cold bite of early fall, the kind that carried the scent of pine and hinted that winter was waiting just over the ridge. Riders gathered near the starting line in a noisy crowd of polished saddles, steaming horses, and loud bets. But one sight silenced the entire field. Mark Bates rode in on a blue Roan stallion so stunning he looked like he'd stepped out of a dream. Cinder's coat shimmered like steel dipped in sunlight. His ears flicked forward with calm confidence. His stride flowed smooth and easy, nothing like the broken creature Jensen had once laughed at. People stepped aside without realizing it, drawn by a sense that they were looking at something rare, something powerful. Jensen Clark watched from atop his massive warm blood tighten. Jensen was dressed like a show rider, in polished boots, fresh breeches, and a tight-fitting riding jacket. Titan wore expensive gear and high-end tack meant to impress the judges of a fancy show ring, not the rough riders of Montana. Jensen sneered as Mark passed. "Hope you said goodbye to that land of yours," he said, "because after today, everything goes back where it belongs." Mark didn't look at him. He just patted Cinder's neck. "Run your race," he whispered. "Let the rest fall where it may." The starter pistol cracked, and the pack surged forward in a thunder of hooves. Jensen leaned low and pushed Titan hard from the start, whipping him through the narrow bottleneck so he could take an early lead. Dust exploded behind him as riders fought for space. Mark did the opposite. He held Cinder back. He let the young stallion settle into a long, ground-covering trot, breathing steady, stride even. Riders shot past him, leaving him at the back of the pack. Spectators frowned, thinking the old cowboy had already lost the race. But Mark knew better. Races weren't won in the first mile. They were won where heart met grit, and where the trail turned cruel. By mile 10, the pack reached the canyons. The trail narrowed into a twisting ribbon of rock and shale. Horses slipped. Riders cursed. Dust burned the eyes of anyone unlucky enough to be in the middle of the mess. But Cinder moved over the rough ground like he had been born for it. Months on the rocky pastures of Cinder Creek had taught him where to place his hooves, how to read the shifting earth, how to keep his balance when other horses panicked. One by one, Mark and Cinder passed riders stuck on bad footing or fighting exhausted mounts. Cinder felt light, willing, calm. He trusted Mark entirely. By mile 15, they were in the top 3. By mile 16, they were in second. Jensen glanced back, his face twisting in disbelief. Titan was drenched in sweat, foam clinging to his chest. The big horse fought the bit, blowing hard, muscles shaking. He wasn't built for the canyon's hard ground. But Jensen didn't care. He whipped him again. Cinder didn't need pushing. He simply kept going, breathing deep, moving strong. Then they reached Deadman's Drop, a narrow ledge, a sheer cliff. A 4-foot break in the trail caused by a rock slide the week before. Titan froze. The big warm blood balked, trembling, refusing to go near the edge. Jensen screamed at him, raising his crop and striking the horse between the ears. "Jump! Jump, you useless thing!" Titan panicked. He reared. His hooves slipped on loose gravel, and Jensen slid right off the saddle. He tumbled over the edge with a scream that ripped straight through the canyon. Mark gasped, yanked Cinder to a stop, and rushed to the cliff. Jensen wasn't gone. Not yet. He had landed on a narrow rock shelf 20 feet down. His leg was twisted at an awful angle. Below him was a 100-foot drop and a roaring river. "Help!" Jensen cried, voice cracking. "Mark, I'm slipping!" Mark had a choice. Ride on and win, or save the man who had tried to ruin his life. He didn't hesitate. He pulled off his lariat and threw the rope down. After 2 tries, Jensen managed to loop it under his shoulders. "I can't pull you up," Mark yelled, "but he can." He tied the rope to Cinder's saddle horn and stood beside the stallion's head. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "Back." Cinder shifted his weight, felt the rope tighten, felt the heavy drag behind him. Any other horse would have panicked, but Cinder trusted the man at his side. Back, step by step by step. Muscles rippling, hooves digging into the dirt. Eyes steady. Cinder pulled Jensen up the cliff inch by inch until Mark grabbed his collar and hauled him onto solid ground. Jensen lay in the dirt, sobbing, sweat and tears mixing on his pale face. "You saved me," he whispered. "Why? I don't deserve it." "Because he's not trash," Mark said softly, patting Cinder's neck, "and neither am I." They finished the race last, walking side by side. The crowd erupted when they crossed the line, not because they had won, but because they had done something far greater. They had shown the whole valley what real strength looked like. Mark didn't win the race, but he won something else. The truth. 2 days later, Mark sat in Jensen's hospital room when the lawyer opened Arthur Clark's sealed instructions. The water rights belonged to the person who proved they cared for the land and a broken horse. Mark had done both. Jensen lost everything that day. Mark gained more than he ever dreamed. He gained the land. He gained the water. He gained the power to rebuild the valley. But most of all, he gained Cinder. A month later, Cinder's original owners came from Kentucky, expecting to take him home. But when they saw how the horse stood beside Mark, calm, proud, loyal, they understood the truth. The horse had already found his forever home. They signed ownership over to Mark and asked only one thing. "If he ever sires a foal, we'd like the first one." Mark smiled through tears. "You've got a deal." Years later, the old trapper shack was gone. In its place stood a sturdy log lodge with flower boxes and a wraparound porch. A sign on the gate read, "Sanctuary at Cinder Creek, a place for second chances." Elderly horses grazed peacefully. A blind pony dozed in the sun. A few frightened rescues learned slowly that not all humans were cruel. And watching over them all was Cinder, his blue roan coat glowing like silver in the evening sun. He lifted his head when he saw Mark on the porch and let out a joyful whinny that echoed through the valley. Mark leaned back in his rocking chair, coffee in hand, peace in his heart. Jensen had called the cabin trash. He had called the horse trash. But both had become treasures. And for the first time in his long, hard life, Mark Bates finally felt found.